Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is co-host Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you this morning.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well.
Good.
We have a very special guest today.
Yes.
And a very special subject, and her name is Hanne Herland. She's from Norway. She's a Norwegian author, founder, and host of the Herland Report. And she recently made a trip promoting her most recent book. And let me just put that book up for a second here, called The Culture War, something that we have talked about here, but she may just have a different perspective, or at least she can explain what's going on in Europe and her perspective on this. She has been a student at Oslo, and interesting enough, she studied the history of the various religions. So, Hanne Herland, welcome to our program today. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, very good. The subject, of course, is the culture war, and you have this book out. I know you've had quite a few other books as well. And you traveled around the States just recently, and you came by Lake Jackson, and we visited, and you did an interview with me. And so I was delighted with that interview and wanted you to come on the program, because I thought you would have some interesting things to say, because you are sort of a world traveler, much more so than I myself. I traveled when I was in the Air Force, but not much else. But Hanne was born in the Congo. She was also growing up in Kenya and Rwanda, which is fascinating. She knows 6 languages, and I think this is really fascinating. But at 19, she went to Norway, and now she's a Norwegian citizen. So this is a very interesting family and background history. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your perspective, because of where you were born and where you were raised, and how you came interested in the various subjects that you've been writing about, and how you got into the Herland Report.
Yes, and let me start off by adding that I currently live in the Middle East, and I work with both Syrians on the ground and Libyans, and this is why we're able to have such cutting-edge reports on the Herland Report, which reaches millions in Europe at the moment. And we also have our TV channel with leading intellectuals that bring to a little bit other perspectives than what we find in the authoritarian mainstream media in the West much today. But I was born and raised in Africa, and I love Africa. I moved to Europe when I was older, and that's when I understood that there is something wrong in the way we portray the world, as several of the great countries in Africa were shown to be horrible states once I got home. So I understood that the European population, even then, this is many years ago, lived under a very controlled media, and we tend to often feel sorry for the people in the Soviet Union, and we say, oh, it must have been horrible for them to live behind this curtain of propaganda. But I have discovered in my life that we certainly do that too, and precisely this kind of hinders us in understanding
I don't know.
Well, it looks like we lost her for a second.
We've lost her.
I'm sure
this is fascinating, and I hope we get her back right real quick, Daniel. But she does have a fascinating history. I want to find out how she came upon this subject that she's dealing with now and wrote a book. It sounds like she's been thinking about that, for a long time, about the problems. And she certainly would have an experience living in Europe and thinking about mass migrations. We've had a lot of immigration and migration, but I don't know.
Well, I think that you have a unique perspective when you've lived abroad for an extended period of time. And I was fortunate enough to have done it as well, and it does make you see your homeland, to see where you've come from a lot differently when you've been overseas for a while.
Yeah.
So it really does add to your perspective. But she writes a lot about. Well, I think she's back with us now.
Hanne, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. I'm so sorry. You know, the internet and something can go wrong. I don't know what happens. Sorry about that.
Well, you'll take that on in the next book you write and make sure this stuff moves smoothly. But we talked a little bit about your experience and why you seems to be right in the right position to talk about this issue of culture wars. And I think Daniel has a point or a question that he'd like to ask you just about what your work has been all about.
Well, your book is fascinating, you know, and it's gosh, you cover a lot of stuff in a really tight, compacted manner. You know, you go from A to Z, and there's so much we could pick apart and talk about. But I think you really pinned the point very early on in your book when you talk about the Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism. I think that really places it almost where it belongs, the origins of a lot of the problems we face today. And I was going to ask you, why do you think it is at least 70 years perhaps after the Frankfurt School was formed, why does it still seem not only to be as strong as ever, but somehow a resurgence in the last maybe 10 or 15 years?
Well, this was precisely the point for me as a historian of religions and many years as a public speaker and worked in the media in Europe to write a book that could explain to ordinary people the philosophical developments that have caused this dramatic shift. Now, it was understandable that post-World War II, that the neo-Marxists tried to look at new models to handle history, because they saw that the old bourgeoisie did have some problems with the power structures, and there were injustice happening in Europe and elsewhere. But I think that the pendulum has swung all the way into the other ditch, to put it that way, and we have ended up removing almost our traditional values in the West. And it's been a resurgence the past 10, 15 years due to Americans being quite ignorant, quite frankly. You have looked to Europe and the welfare states in Europe, which have been mainly socialistic states, and you've decided all of a sudden, at the slope of the decline of America and the loss of values and loss of wisdom and understanding in America, you've decided to follow the European example, which is a faltering model in Europe. And you only need to look at the mass migration, the problems within the EU, to understand that I think you've been very mistaken in bringing this type of thinking back. But it's true. It's a thinking that initially was a good idea, but the left has a few good values, the original left, such as solidarity, empathy with the weak. But the problem with the left-wing progressives, both in the United States and in Europe, is that they have long ago left their initial good values and entered into the world of globalism, which has made the 1% rich and everyone else losing the middle class and etc. So I think that the initial idea of the progressives was to correct the bourgeoisie and the right-wing parties in Europe, but they themselves have ended up being the ultra-rich, now controlling the rest of us. So that's the issue.
Right. Now, since you travel a lot, you've just been to the States, how do you compare the man in the street, the average person? You do a lot of interviews and you talk to a lot of people. How do you compare the man in the streets in the United States compared to the average person in Europe? Are they more concerned? Do they better understand this? Do they know a little bit of a history? Do the Americans understand it? Or how do you compare the two? Or do you think it's all one mass of people evaluating this situation equally?
It's a strange thing, actually, because when you speak to regular Europeans, the people, they are highly frustrated. Our system is pretty much the same. It's a globalized system today, stemming from much of what's been decided in Washington with the neoconservatives and also the ultra-rich elites in Europe, in the United States, control much of what we also have in our mainstream medias in Europe. And so it's strange to speak to regular people, the little man that nobody seems to care about. anymore, because the people in Europe are so angered at what's happening. They're so angered at their political elites. We saw this example of Brexit and so much of the disarray with both Catalonia and many areas in Europe today. They are complaining because they say that our politicians no longer care for the people. They're out to get excellent positions and join the rich clubs in Davos, and they don't care about solving the problems in Europe. And it was strange to me. I spoke to very many people in the US. This is part of my job as a trend analyst. And strange thing, every single one we were in touch with in the United States, a regular, the small guy, the waitresses, the taxi drivers, were of the same opinion, stating it's such a sad fact that our Western civilization is deteriorating into a culture that only benefits the ultra-rich. And what happened to our democracy, we don't know either. And so it surprised me, Dr. Paul, that many so agreed with our European view on the Middle East, and our sadness to see that billions of US dollars go out of the country and finance wars. And the Libya situation, for example, was horrible. Millions are killed. Instead of spending that money fixing the United States, which is a country that now, quite frankly, sorry to say, looks like it's still in 1970. When you land on the American airport, sorry to say, it's like going back in time to the 1970s, and the decline in the US and the erosion of the middle class is horrible to watch. But the little man in the street, he is not as stupid as much in the mainstream media would portray him to be, but he is subdued maybe, and he doesn't have a voice in the media, but it looks to me as though he understands what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book and in several interviews that I've seen that you've done, you've tied the decline in what you call Western values to really the decline in Christianity in the West, and I think that's a very interesting and probably a very well put point. You know, America considers itself essentially a Christian nation. You have its leaders talking about Christianity, some more than others. But how do you explain, and you say that you worked in Syria and you do work in the Middle East, it seems that every U.S. intervention in that part of the world seems to hit Christians disproportionately. The Christian community in Syria, for example, faced not only decline but decimation if the U.S. had been successful in backing some of these jihadists that were almost taking over. How do you see this disconnect between what we say and the results of what we do in the Middle East?
Well, it's the grand old problem of hypocrisy, and of course, it's hard to go anywhere in the Middle East now and find other than contempt, pure contempt towards America. And it's a paradox, of course, that the forces that the U.S. under the previous government supported. Let me talk about the Libya war, for example, where you had the Al-Qaeda leaders or the leaders affiliated with Al-Qaeda were the ones that the NATO worked with. There are pictures of John McCain with Abdullah Kimbel-Haj, who's one of the leaders of that movement in Libya. And this man later was greeted and as a, and became one of Africa's richest men. So it's a strange combination. But also then again, this has been happening in in American foreign policy ever since Afghanistan and before then, that you ally with certain groups and then you work against them and then you ally with them again. So currently it's been a sad thing to see to which degree both ISIS and Al-Qaeda has been allied with American forces. And it's very strange because when you look at Muammar Gaddafi, for example, he was, you wouldn't say a secular leader, but he was a moderate Muslim. His greatest enemy were the Al-Qaeda in the Benghazi area, which were the ones supported by the United States to overthrow him and Qatar and so on. So it's a paradox to see that the United States so actively supports the erosion of moderate leaders and pan-Arabic leaders in the Middle East, and would like to have instead the Islamist group take over, who to a large degree are allied then again yet with Saudi Arabia. And it's the same thing in Syria. We've seen Bashar al-Assad, for example. He's supported by the Christians. Obviously, not all that he has done is always excellent, but he is considered to be the leader of the support for the diversity in the Middle East. So it's a strange thing going on, and maybe the American leadership can explain to us why they support the genocide against the Christians and other groups in the Middle East.
Hannah, the issue here, of course, is how do we solve our problems? We have the government dealing in bad ideas and bad economic policy. And then we have this principle of what are the people thinking? And personal morality. Our founders, almost to the T, always said that, yes, we live in a free society, we're giving you a constitution, but it's only workable in a moral society. So if we concentrate on government, and in a way, I was in government for a long time, but I never saw myself as a legislator as much as trying to change people's attitudes. So I think the challenge is how does legislation and more government action and political action change things if it's really the basic morality of the people and what they believe in? And I tried to combine the two, thinking that this is important, but sometimes people say, well, no, it's just government. Then you have the deep state, and they control government, and they control us. And then you see the deterioration of the people's morality, and it seems like that is almost the bigger problem. If we had a moral nation, maybe they'd all follow our Constitution, we'd be better off. Do you see the bit of a disconnect there, and how do you resolve that or bring those two issues together?
Most definitely, and this is why I would encourage people to read The Culture War, my book, because in that book I explained that, quite in detail, because we have really changed the idea of what is right and what is wrong, and we have deconnected the Western culture from morality. This was in the pursuit of overcoming the mistakes of the bourgeoisie in Europe at the time, and the part of the reason why the pendulum has swung this far is that we have removed the respect for the Ten Commandments, removed the respect for equality, which was a genuine Christian value. The equality based on, regardless of ethnic origin, which used to be such a founding principle in the United States. Back in the time when you used to do very well, there was this notion that the U.S. is a melting pot and everyone is welcome there, regardless of creed or race. And the recent years, the U.S. has moved away from that. And when you remove the Ten Commandments and the respect for the Ten Commandments in a culture, thou shalt not steal, once it becomes popular to steal, we do get a problem. And once we get capitalism devoid of trustworthiness and a capitalist system devoid of the Protestant ethic, then we get a culture of greed. And when we don't have a capitalism that provides some sort of moral redistribution and to take care of the elderly and many of the subgroups in society that also are not as fortunate as the rich, we also do get an erosion of values. So at the core of this, I agree with the atheist, Jürgen Habermas, one of the famous philosophers here in Europe. He says that we were mistaken in removing the Christian ethic. Disregard whether you believe in God or not. We should have kept the Christian ethic because it does have an ability to motivate individuals to do what is right and to think about each other. So I think we need to return to some of the old-fashioned values and reincorporate those in order to get a warmer society where people take care of each other more.
Now, Hannah, you write in your book and in discussions, interviews I've seen, rightly, I think, about the decline of European values and European culture in Europe. But there are some counter currents that I'm sort of interested in what you might think about it. And I'm thinking particularly, well, we saw the re-election of Miloš Zeman in the Czech Republic, but I'm thinking particularly of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who really is the bête noire not only of Brussels but of Washington. And you know, when he was first elected, the Hungarians passed a new constitution in 2010. The opening line was, "Hungary is a Christian country," and of course that got everyone very upset. How do you view the sort of Orban phenomenon? He's been able to resist the EU demands that they settle thousands of refugees. He is extremely popular in Hungary, but extremely unpopular in Brussels and Washington.
Well, this again speaks for the erosion of democracy, both in the United States and consequently also in Europe. I mean, we know over 70% of the NATO, the money in the NATO stems from the United States, and the elites in Washington control much of the media also in Europe. Over 90% of the American media now owned by only 6 corporations, and half of those also own the weapons industry in the United States. So the globalism has led to, Oxfam recently came out with statistics, over 80% now of the world assets belong to less than the 1%. So it's a rich elite that doesn't care about the people. This is the erosion. We could have looked at foreign policy, US foreign policy, to see the same trends. And when money, frankly, goes hand in hand with politics and the lobbyists in Washington pay off here and there and all of that, then you get a situation where the media is actually helping the ultra-rich in the U.S. get their wars everywhere so that they become rich. And one could mention George Soros, of course, hedge fund owner, once he shorts on, let's say, a country going down, and then he goes in with all his NGOs and pays billions to make sure that country goes down, then we have kind of like an inside trading, looking at it from a Wall Street perspective. So, and speaking about Hungary in this position, we've seen how the EU has turned into quite the same elitist phenomena. They all gather at Davos, control the media, and within the European population, it's a big distress because in Italy, they're not allowed to do their pizzas anymore. Everybody has to drink from Starbucks. I mean, the trends of the globalist large corporations moving in and taking control makes the people in Europe react. And I think what we see in Hungary, for certain, what we also see in Norway and in Scandinavia, what we saw with the Brexit, what we also saw with the election of Donald Trump, points in the direction that the people want to get away from these elitist leaders. And that's the situation we have in Europe as well. For example, look at the mass migration. I mean, the EU tries to give off billions to Erdogan to make him make the problem go away. They don't show leadership. Frankly, I think they should replace those ladies that don't even wash their hair properly and get some real, hard-boiled men to control Europe again that can care about the people there and that let these ladies go somewhere else.
Well, I find this fascinating, and I keep thinking about how to bring people together. And I certainly agree about the Western culture was influenced by Christianity and the Christian ethic. But most big religions have more or less not denied that lie, cheating, stealing, and killing aren't necessarily a religious determination, that they, matter of fact, would take the position that we shouldn't do those kind of things. And we do live in a much more global world than ever before, but now it's becoming diverse and we're fighting about what is the influence. I keep believing sincerely that the principle, which is in a way secular, but it also includes these principles of Christianity and others, and the 10 Commandments, and that is the non-aggression principle. That people can't hurt each other, and we shouldn't allow governments to do that. If that one principle could be taught and understood, and it's a moral principle, and they understand this, it seems to me that we have a chance of bringing now that the cultures are so diverse. Yes, it's okay. You can come, but you can't come here with authoritarianism and violence. There has to be this acceptance that you do not commit violence and you don't ask the government to do this. And I'm sure you, Hannah, have thought a little bit about the non-aggression principle. Maybe I'm overly optimistic that one principle could do a lot of good, but I actually believe it could.
Well, the thing is, this is what you're speaking about really is the complete failure of American Christianity, the complete failure of the white evangelicalism movement, the just complete failure of morality in the United States. And the Christians, quite frankly, obviously don't care. We see little empathy. We don't see compassion, but we see support for the killings and bombings of other people, which brings us to another point in American society. There's no respect for human rights. Maybe there's human rights for a person like me, since I'm white and all, with blue eyes or green eyes. That's the kind of person that has any form of human rights in the world we live in. When we come to people of other skin colors, there's no human rights. Speak to Libyans, speak to Syrians, speak to Iraqis that are so expendable in the eyes of Madeleine Albright and others. So we don't see ourselves as one big family, that we're all created by God and all God's children. So this is frankly a big hypocrisy going on in the West today. And we need to have another kind of system. But the problem is, too, that everyone in the world, they see this. Speak to Russians, they understand this. They understand that there is no human rights for other groups in society. So this is part of the erosion of we don't take our values seriously enough. And it brings us back to the fall of the Roman Empire. That was what happened at the end of the Roman Empire, the same tendency we see in the United States today, where so much of your army is privatized and going into Blackwater. I mean, it's a mercenary army, actually, there for hire, for one. So there's a lot of the erosion of values are important to combat.
Hannah, I want to thank you very much. We're going to have to close, but I do want to mention once again your book, The Culture War, and advise people to take a good look at this. It's a good book. And I want to thank you, Hannah, for joining us today for this fascinating conversation. And hopefully we can do it again.
Thank you very much.
Very good. And I want to thank our viewers today for tuning into this very special program, and come back soon.